Hi, my name's Anthony Hook. I'm the co-founder and CTO of DataWeavers, and today I'm going to talk to you about how to build a best practice DevOps solution for the Sitecore platform. So just a little bit about myself. I have a customer experience and MarTech background. I spent many years working for the Sitecore team in the product strategy group, and last year I left to set up a series of companies and agencies that essentially help customers and partners utilize and take the Sitecore platform to the next level. Tend to find myself happy when I'm fishing, but I'm also happy when I'm helping customers get stuff done in a very simple and elevated way. So building a scalable and manageable DevOps process is fundamentally about one thing. It's about change. And change in an organization is about building trust. So what does change mean to you? Well, change drives organizations. It's the operational rhythm, it's the organizational rhythm. Many of you will have come across this. You want to make a change request, you want to get something live, and bang, it's been rejected. You haven't filled out the documentation, you can't prove that you can roll back. Your organization and your customers will likely have change processes, and they may even have an entire change management team. So if you can help understand how that change management works within a given organization, you're essentially going to put yourself and your team in that position of trust. So what are the fundamentals of change management? Well, change management is about going from the current state to the transition state to the target state. But only if you truly understand the current state can you predict the transition and target states. So in a Sitecore context, what does that mean? Well, we spend a lot of time working with change managers, working with IT teams to understand how to get through cap and tag requests, change management, change advisory boards, and all of the associated processes. And they tend to require things like a detailed solution design. They want you to be able to demonstrate the architecture, demonstrate that you're adhering to best practices. Sitecore has made huge changes over the last few years to really bring change management and best practice into the way that Sitecore is delivered. We look at the Helix principles, we look at the adoption of Microsoft Azure PaaS. There is fundamentally no reason to deviate from the Sitecore best practices when doing the basic things that Sitecore requires. Of course, business case alignment is critical. As a developer, we're not always aware of the full business case of what we're doing and why we're doing it, but from a DevOps perspective and from a change management perspective, we're about reducing the TCO of a given environment and improving the ROI of a business so that they can move faster and deliver faster. One of the big things that we look for and we find that is required when we're going through change processes is as-built documentation. That's the difference between the solution design that you put forward and how the solution ended up being delivered. Now that solution might be one small code change or it might be an entire platform rebuild. The solution design is never the as-built documentation because fundamentally something changes. We learn something along the way. It might be one day between the change request and the go live, or it might be 5 months. Being able to take the solution design and articulate why something changed and use that as the as-built documentation is going to help you define that transition state and sign off on the target state. So I'm a developer. There's a whole bunch of people in my team. Is this really valuable for me? Where do I start? Well, you're going to have to start somewhere, and here's a recommendation. So one of the things that we do with our clients is we start with the audit, or otherwise known as the benchmark. If you can document your current platform, that's going to help you set the benchmark. The screenshot example I've got there is 65 questions that we ask every single Sitecore implementation owner to understand what the current landscape is, where the problems might be, who the dependencies are, the stakeholders, the sign-off processes, number of content items, the type of dependency injection we're using, the number of databases that we've got, and the customizations you might have applied. Once you've got this benchmark done, you can articulate the change that you're implementing, and you can also identify areas for improvement. So the solution design. There are key parts to the solution design, and I'm going to go through some of those right now. This is our opinion on how you can build a solution design. You may have your own versions, but if you cover these 10 critical things, you're in a much better place when you're defining the current state. So the stakeholder map and their associated roles and responsibilities. If you have IT, security, network, perimeter, DNS, you have business managers, marketing owners, email owners, campaign teams. Get those stakeholders mapped out, get their names on the page and their job titles, and then define their roles and responsibilities. I'm not talking about an organizational chart. What I'm saying is, in the change management that you are affecting right now, the go live or the new release you're doing, what are they responsible for? Are they responsible? Are they informed? Are they accountable? Are they consulted? You could go to a full RACI model if you wanted to, or you could just simply say, this person needs to sign off solution design, this person is responsible for go live, this person is responsible for signing off the code, and this guy's responsible for backup. Now get the business requirements in. Once you've got the business requirements in, you can start to align. So for example, if we're doing a move from Sitecore 8 to 9, what is the business requirements? Does it need to be faster than the current solution? Do we need to enable email experience manager or marketing automation? Do we need to migrate from web forms to forms? If we can get the business requirements in there, that's when we can start to understand the impact. We can communicate to the business the value of the change that we're making. And when we go through and deliver and we're audited, we're in a much better place to explain what we did and why we did it. Architecture choices. Working in the enterprise for probably the last 15 years, there are plenty of architects who have opinions on what should and shouldn't be done in a given Sitecore implementation. The downside I find is that very few of those architects actually understand what Sitecore does or how it works. They tend to be enterprise architects, and they tend to be looking at things from a best practice as to how it hangs together with the rest of the organization. How is Sitecore consuming APIs within the organization? How is it being delivered inside the application architecture? How does it play nicely with the other tools? As an agency developer or an in-house developer responsible for building and delivering Sitecore, go and talk to your enterprise architects. Get them to understand the basics, really take them through the solution design, and get those guys and girls on board first. They're the critical ones for me. Capacity planning. As we move from Sitecore on perpetual licensing to subscription licensing, we have a lot more flexibility to scale the platform and do things in a different way. So traditionally a CM server and a CD server configured to handle load is now very different, with 10 separate roles in the Sitecore solution: marketing automation, XConnect, processing, reporting, databases, etc. Capacity planning is essentially one simple thing. We take the peak number of traffic that we have in a given year. We estimate how much we're going to handle that peak. So is it going to be once a month peak, once a quarter peak, or even a once a year peak, maybe like a university who is peaking because of their apply and accept process once a year. Once we take the peak, we can translate that back to the number of page views. We can then go to the standard Sitecore sizing documentation, and we can simply say we will need 3 content delivery servers to handle that peak load. Once the capacity plan is done and we're looking at the delivery choice, such as Microsoft Azure PaaS, then we can start to understand whether we're going to do basic load with auto scaling, or we're going to scale to handle the peak load because we've just got money to burn. So once you go through that environment sizing and cost planning, what you can do is communicate to the organization what the cost of the given environment is going to be, where the variables are. Microsoft Azure PaaS changes the landscape completely differently to IaaS or typical VM hosting. With Microsoft Azure PaaS, you have a lot more knobs and levers that you can twist and turn to get things in the right sizes that you require. So what we have to do there is we then have to pacify CIOs and IT managers that we're not going to turn everything up to 11 and burn tons of cash really, really quickly. So if we can say, hey, the environment is going to cost this much in a given standard scenario, we're going to get approval to go up by 30%, for example, should we a peak load without prior approval, without approval at the time. So we can do auto scale with pre-approval. And then maybe we can put an approval process that if we hit 50% capacity, we can go to one specific person in the organization and approve that cost going up. It's a fundamental mind shift. It's a change from where we are today with typical rack and tin and moving to platform as a service. The senior business leaders that I work with are always scared of those ability to just scale things really quickly. You've got to get that nailed down, you've got to get that pacified, and you've got to get that agreed in the solution design. Then you've got the CI/CD process. So that's what we're talking a little bit about today, about the DevOps. We've got security and backup. You've got to get across those guys. You've got to define how security works, IP restrictions, VPNs, CDN, DNS, SSL, and of course backup as well. Make it clear what your point-in-time restore recovery process is. Make sure that we define how many times a week we're taking a backup, whether that be the application, the databases, or the associated infrastructure as code scripts that go with it. Application monitoring. The number of organizations that are investing in things like SolarWinds and Splunk and application insights is proliferating. I have found log management systems talking to other log management systems, going to other log management systems in these huge dependency chains where they can be quite complex. And as a dev or somebody in the Sitecore world, you go, what's the value in this? I've got the Sitecore logs and application insights are on the file system. But those organizations with the bigger IT teams are looking to fold Sitecore into their major monitoring stack. So sit down and work out, do you need to install the Splunk connector? Do you need to install the SolarWinds connector on the application itself? Get that defined, get across that. The reason why you do that in the solution design is it's going to kill you later on if you don't predict it. You're going to end up losing a day. You're going to have somebody from the IT team, reject your sign-off because it's not connected to the Splunk stack or the SolarWinds stack. So policies and standards alignment. When you're working with financial institutions and educational institutions, they usually have very well documented policies and standards, such as backups must be taken in this particular frequency. They must be stored in this particular location. Change requests must be submitted to this particular person. It's very similar to the stakeholder map, but essentially what you're doing is you're saying policy A in this location in this document has been adhered to, tick yes or no. It's not a problem if you're not adhering to a given policy, but you need to document that that policy has not been adhered to for that reason. And that might be a Sitecore limitation. I was working with a customer who had a security test done a few weeks ago, and the way that the Sitecore cookie is working was not perfect. It was fine, but it wasn't perfect as per this security test. We simply said, I'm sorry, it's a part of the application architecture. We're not prepared to customize the Sitecore application to suit a level of security that we don't think is required. Once you document that and communicate it, the team were fine. Okay, we'll keep moving. Of course, we chucked it back to Sitecore and asked them to take a look at it, but not critical for go live. And then the technical change backlog. This is where, because you've been going through the architecture, you've done the discovery, you've identified all the areas for improvement, you can go through and define what's the technical change backlog that you're going to be going through in this change request. And of course, the sign-off process. Get the sign-off. If you don't, you're just essentially causing yourselves hassle. Now, many agencies already have well-documented sign-off processes with their customers. I'm talking here about the internal sign-off. So it's okay for maybe the head of digital to sign off the change in the release, or maybe the technical director in the agencies to sign off and say go live. But making sure that the sign-off of the solution design is done, so that when we get into the transition state and the end state, we've got that document that we can fall back on. Nobody can disagree that what the change that we were making was an issue. So what does one of those solution designs look like? Well, here's the one that we use. This is a boilerplate. It's about 30 pages long. It's very, very simple to complete. We actually use this and repeat this process for every single customer that we work with. This explains the differences between Microsoft Azure IaaS and VMs and the PaaS solution. It explains the difference around average and peak load. It talks about the differences between Solar and Azure Search, and by the way, we always choose Azure Search. And then it has the technical backlog and the RACI document and everything down the bottom there. One thing I also take in this document as well is the Microsoft Azure pricing calculator, and I actually stamp out the customer's request and I put the RRP pricing into the document, and then I'm able to compare that against the existing pricing for the current hosting environment and their new one. Of course, this solution design assumes that I'm moving from Azure IaaS and VMs to Microsoft Azure PaaS. Your change request might be a lot simpler and not require that level of detail. And of course, visualizing the solution design. Now, there's a big reason why I'm going into a level of detail here around the actual architecture, because this is a big part of how you plan and build a DevOps process. So there's a big benefit to visualizing the solution design. If you've ever been through a Sitecore pre-sales process, you'll know that the pre-sales team have access to all the Visio diagrams for Sitecore, and every time a customer is sold a license, an environment diagram is usually attached along with that. And the reason that they do that is so they can visualize the landscape. People still think in terms of servers and boxes and machines. And even though Sitecore 9 is very role-based, this does just give you that visualization of how, not so much complex Sitecore is, but how you can contain it and how you can map it. So there are a few benefits. It's easy to identify any enhancements that you've made. The diagram you've got in front of you here on the far right-hand side has a full geo-scaled replication in another data center. It helps you plan your DevOps flow. You might be able to read out on the screen there that the dev environment on the left-hand side is fully automated. So the DevOps system is building and releasing without approval, and that's always kept up to date. you'll see that the UAT there's got a manual deploy, so that's got a release pipeline, and that has an approval workflow. So you click approve, and that will then automatically deploy after the approval's been given. The production set and the production secondary, however, has been configured to use staging slots. So that one has some level of automation, but it's still a manual approval process to execute the automation. And it also helps distill what is essentially a very complex platform to non-technical people. Non-technical doesn't necessarily just mean non-technical people, it mostly means non-Sitecore people. There's still plenty of technical stakeholders in the organization you need to address and pacify, but they don't know Sitecore. And these diagrams make a massive difference when you're trying to communicate the vast capability of the Sitecore platform. Now, presenting your design, this is a step that I feel is missed, and it often leads to a lot of ambiguity, or it leads to ignorance in the solution design. So if you create a solution design and you try and get it signed off by one or two stakeholders, they don't always ask the right questions. They don't always sort of go and delve into something to make sure that they're happy with it. They'll often read it and go, yeah, I'm fine with that. So I've got a bit of a recommended discovery meeting and presentation schedule. And this is the process that we run through with each client. So do the discovery workshop with the internal IT team. Bring as many stakeholders as you see valuable. Don't invite everybody. Go through that architecture design workshop. Go through IT security and platform. Then finish the solution design, circulate it for a review. Give them a date that you're going to present it to them, but get the Q&A out before you go to the meeting. Then do the solution presentation and try and get stakeholder sign-off in that meeting. Make sure all the questions and all the answers, and you will know your organization better than anyone else, and you'll know your customer better than anyone else. So try and think about the questions that they're not asking that you know they need to ask. I'm not necessarily talking about, forcing them to ask questions that will cause trouble, but if you know that IT and platform haven't asked about IP restrictions or haven't asked about VPNs and you think they should, then maybe think about saying, are you happy with the IP configuration? Are you happy with the way we're protecting the content management server? Do not leave that meeting until you have stakeholder sign-off. And if you can't agree sign-off in that meeting, cut the meeting, go back to the workshop, go back to the design, and then rebook a meeting to get the stakeholders to sign off. Getting stakeholder sign-off at the end of that meeting, make sure you're all on the same page, and it means you can move forward without any ambiguity. So common blockers for DevOps in the cloud. These are just some of the big blockers that we see in organizations. So there's no knowledge of PaaS. Microsoft Azure PaaS is an entirely new world for hosting. It's infrastructure as code, it's ARM templates, it's PowerShell, it's scripting. It's a user interface in terms of the Azure Blade and the UI to deliver an entirely vastly complex hosting solution. We don't log into servers anymore, well maybe on the VMs, but not on the Azure PaaS. We're not managing the underlying operating system. We are essentially configuring the solution and then pulling that back to infrastructure as code. That scares a lot of people. Microsoft have got fantastic training courses, but in reality, you're not going to get your IT teams to go and do those training courses in time to do a Sitecore release. It also doesn't help if you're a non-cloud friendly organization. There are plenty of organizations across the globe who have tried to move to cloud and they failed, or something's gone wrong, or it wasn't as easy as they were professed it was going to be. Sitecore is usually the last application in many people's minds when it comes to moving over to the cloud if you're not already on the cloud and you didn't start in the cloud. They're too busy working on things like Office 365 and line of business applications inside the organization, and Sitecore's just sort of out there on the perimeter. But with great solution design and clear presentation of the facts, you can bypass that. And in many organizations, we've been able to position Sitecore as ultimately a SaaS play by saying, look, we can utilize the Sitecore Managed Cloud Platform. You can utilize all the Microsoft Azure PaaS tools for delivering this solution. And IT have gone fine. We're very happy with that. We understand the value. And it's more of a delivered cloud rather than a very custom, very complex cloud. Changing roles is another one. I recall a situation recently where we're working with a DB team who were inside a big organization, and they had a team of people dedicated to managing the Sitecore SQL servers on a regular basis in terms of maintenance plans and backups and Windows updates and all of those things. They hadn't done any work in Azure SQL, and when we put forward the solution design to move from Sitecore 8 to Sitecore 9 and go to PaaS at the same time, the DB team was struggling to really comprehend the differences in SQL on-prem and SQL Azure. Now, that wasn't necessarily a technical blocker, it was more of a, hang on, something's changing in my role, this program is moving way faster than I'm used to moving in this organization, And I don't so much know whether it was a lack of control or a lack of understanding, but it became one of the biggest blockers in the project for getting the solution design signed off. So we made some enhancements to our solution design so that we can articulate the differences on an operational level, not so much a technical level. In other words, what are you doing week in, week out, day in, day out to this solution? And budget apprehension. There is a myth, I don't know how common it is, I see it probably in 50% of customers, that moving to the Azure PaaS cloud is more expensive than running rack and tin VMs. Well, that may be true if the rack and tin VMs you've got are terrible and you're buying them from a budget provider. You may be going from a budget provider to Microsoft Azure PaaS where you are buying the Rolls-Royce of cloud. So that might be one position that we see. I think fundamentally, whilst the PaaS app services and SQL configurations can look slightly more expensive on a tin-to-tin basis, when you start to understand that you're not patching the underlying operating system and you're not managing the disks that sit underneath it, and you don't have to worry about rebuilding and scaling Solar and all those wonderful things, and the solution is coming truly as a service, what you start to realize is the overall TCO in terms of the hardware that you're buying, or the PaaS that you're buying, and the time it takes to manage it and deploy it drastically reduces. Again, that solution design can communicate the differences in both people and time, and then the actual hardware software cost itself. And the good old one, we've always done it this way. We've always released like that. We've always left the code in UAT for 1 week before we go live. That's just how we've always done it. Well, cool, let's just keep doing it that way. You might find in your organization there are processes that are slowing you down from delivering at what we will call the speed of marketing. Marketing organizations don't like waiting for complex IT teams or complex IT or business change processes. They need to take up the opportunities in the market as they come. They need to deliver campaigns and landing pages and forms and experiences very quickly. So again, by using the solution design to say that we are delivering Sitecore in a best practice way to get access to more technology faster so we can release and deploy faster, this is the reason why we don't want to continue doing that way. Usually when it comes down to articulating that clearly, nobody can disagree with the facts, and if then you still get a disagreement, well, you've got another problem, and then you're going to have to start going and bashing on people's doors. But that solution design really makes a big difference. So skills. You've gone, okay, Anthony, I completely get the impact of change management. I completely understand why DevOps is going to solve this for me. I'm going to do this. I'm going to move everybody to a brilliant DevOps process. I'm going to move over to the Microsoft Azure PaaS cloud. What do I need? Well, there's a few skills. DevOps skills comes between people, process, and technology. The people and process skills, something look like this. So business value and focus. You need to be able to demonstrate the business value of every change that you're making. If the current process you have now is on-prem and based on normal DevOps tools, and you can deliver that in deliver a Sitecore release in 30 minutes, and you're going to move to Microsoft Azure PaaS and Azure DevOps and release in 28 minutes, is there really a business benefit? There may be a long-term one, but you've got to articulate whether it's a short-term benefit or a long-term benefit. That's a people skill, and if you don't have that in the sort of this place that you sit in the organization and your personality and skill set, then go and talk to your business managers, go and talk to some of your senior leaders, say, look, I'm trying to implement and affect this change, can you help me articulate and communicate this to the business? I think it's about knowing the business more than anything else, but always coming back to the business value and keeping a laser focus on that is going to get you really far really quickly. You need to be able to integrate multiple teams. As somebody looking after the development lifecycle inside the Sitecore solution that you're working with, you're going to need to go to IT, security, platform, storage, business, change, marketing. Go and find your key stakeholders, make your friends, make those relationships, get them across the solution designs, get them in early. Talk to them about the problems that you're having, being able to deliver for their team, and get them to raise that within the organization so that you're consistent in the message you put forward. Now, documentation. I don't mean lack of Sitecore documentation, of course. What I mean is documentation about your organization. You're going to be asked questions. You're going to need to be able to answer those questions quickly. If you have that audit done at the beginning, that's going to be your Bible for any given change. Keep that audit up to date every time you make major structural changes to the organization, and publish it along with the solution design. Say, hey, the solution design was built based on this set of factual information. Keep that documentation up to date, and as you get into the enterprise size delivery for Sitecore, it's going to make a massive difference, and it's going to increase velocity wherever you go. Stakeholder alignment. It's kind of like integrating multiple teams, but stakeholder alignment is where you've got essentially bring religion into the process. So if you have one stakeholder over here in an IT team and one in a marketing team, there can be opposing views that are purely just based on, I think this is the better way to do it. You're going to come across those situations and you're going to need to find a solution. Again, as-built documentation, the solution design, all of the reference architecture that you've got, get those stakeholders in a room, get them aligned and try and work through that. You may not be able to solve every stakeholder problem, and that can be a blocker sometimes, but it's a big skill required when you're going to the DevOps model. And empathy. This is something that's really key. You've got to stand in the customer's shoes. Now, the customer might be the end customer using the website, but it also might be the marketing team who's consuming your Sitecore solution. Try and understand what it is they're trying to get done, what they're trying to achieve, and you'll often find that you can, as a byproduct, solve a number of their problems that you didn't even realize that they had. A good example of that is with the Sitecore 9 solution delivery we do on Azure PaaS. We essentially enable email and marketing automation out of the box with a whole bunch of templates because we just sort of had it there. And when we talked to a couple of stakeholders in one of our organizations, they said, well, we've been meaning to move to the email at some point, but we just never really had it on our radar and just didn't have the time. And so, well, hang on a second, we just, didn't realize that because it's enabled, it's kind of there. And they logged in, they got started using it, and they were able to realize value. So again, just having a chat with the organization and saying, well, what's really important to you, you'll start to yield more benefits and hopefully improve TCO and then improve ROI as well. Now, technology. Okay, so we've got all that people stuff and the fluffy stuff out the way. If you're going to move to a great DevOps process and you're going to move to Azure PaaS, you're going to need to know ARM templates. In my opinion, implementing a DevOps process that is still based on an IaaS and VM type environment, I don't feel like you're getting the best out of it. If you're going to move to DevOps, you want to go to a predictable infrastructure as code, scriptable deployment methodology, and the rack and tin solutions don't usually provide that in the best way possible. So I always tend to couple DevOps and Azure PaaS as sort of two things together. But ARM templates are a new world. They're sort of it's about taking that infrastructure, building that in a documented format, and then being able to execute the ARM template through PowerShell against the Azure APIs to build out your infrastructure. A lot of the time, organizations are tempted to configure something in Azure PaaS and then use the UI to change tick boxes and move sliders, and then forget to take the underlying ARM template code and put that back in their repository. And what that means is that when you then have to build a new infrastructure or you have to go to a DR scenario and try and execute the ARM template you used originally to build it, you've missed all those little configurations. So having an appreciation for how ARM templates are modified inside the Azure environment and then bringing that back into your infrastructure repository is a massive skill that you can work on. PowerShell, most of us know PowerShell, not too much of an issue there. Now, Azure Active Directory. One of the major pacifiers for any IT organization is being able to demonstrate that you're playing inside their chosen security model. Most organizations are Active Directory based, some are others, and Sitecore supports that. But when it comes to the DevOps and the infrastructure and the actual PaaS hosting, knowing Azure Active Directory is really good. If you understand the basics of roles and groups, the basics of permissions, and the basics of service principles, you can then demonstrate that you're controlling the entire security chain from end to end, from code check-in to live delivery. Of course, Git and VSTS, they're two skills that are really important, and Sitecore packaging. When you're moving into DevOps, this is about moving code and content between environments. So being able to have a really good skill set around Sitecore packaging, whether that be the TDS or Unicorn or just hopes and dreams, it really does make a difference to know that. So technology choices. Best practice is your friend. It's always your friend. Sitecore is a very complex beast that's changing all the time. And whilst we sometimes have to step outside of the box to achieve the things we want to, when you start to adopt best practices like Helix, you are reducing complexity, you are reducing cost, you're improving project velocity, and you're increasing stability every time. So that's why I believe in choosing a Microsoft first approach when it comes to Sitecore every time. Sitecore is and always has been a Microsoft first technology. I know they did that little Mongo thing a while ago, but it's always been Microsoft first. Now, centralizing on those Microsoft technologies, including the DevOps, means that you will increase chance of success. You are reducing complexity, cost, and you're increasing confidence in your organization around DevOps. Whilst DevOps for Sitecore is a a contained process, DevOps for the rest of your organization and all the bespoke applications that they have is becoming a religion. It's becoming a way of life, and it's becoming an art. You might even find that DevOps teams are appearing in IT across the rest of the organization, and they will be wanting to choose particular technologies. They may be using, the cloud-based solutions or NOps solutions, to manage those big complex processes. But they are DevOps for bespoke applications, not DevOps for Sitecore. DevOps for Sitecore is about, again, repeated, best practice, and pretty much get away with delivering the same type of delivery and release process every time. You're not going to go wrong choosing Microsoft Azure if the organization is already invested in Microsoft and Microsoft Azure hosting. So there's a couple of reasons why Microsoft First makes a big difference. Sitecore 9, 100% Azure PaaS compatible. Sitecore is investing heavily in Microsoft Azure. The PaaS and DevOps also share Active Directory for very granular security. One dev can have check-in rights, one dev can have approval to UAT rights, one dev can have approval to live. Azure DevOps is truly SaaS and does require no servers to maintain, which is just going to save you money both in the servers that you're hosting and the chance of downtime, but also the people that have to sit there and maintain those. As a Sitecore dev, the last thing you want to be worrying about is running out of disk space and running Windows updates. And if you're moving to a true Sitecore cloud solution, it's my belief that moving to something like Azure DevOps is going to be a true cloud DevOps solution for you as well. And a massive benefit as well is centralized billing in Azure. I've seen a few dev teams recently where the IT managers were not aware of the cost of the VMs and the Octopus deploys and the other solutions that were sitting there on those machines until 6, 7, 8, 9 months afterwards. They get a big shock because it's not costed, it's not budgeted, and there's an extra $2,000, $3,000 basically sitting there burning from a DevOps perspective. When you move to a SaaS DevOps solution, you can be paying hundreds of dollars a month, you can pay for on-demand, and it can be centralized, and the visibility of billing in Azure makes a huge difference. It takes it out of your hands and it puts it into the business owner's hands. So what's our approach? So at DataWeavers, we have a repeatable process, and we have essentially a delivery and deployment pipeline specifically for Sitecore. So on the left-hand side here, we're focusing on Sitecore 9, building in Helix, keeping the dev in the Visual Studio world, giving them access to all the tools and the way that they want to deliver and build Sitecore. But then in the center here, we have Azure DevOps. So this is where we configure code, build, work, test, and automated release processes. We have wrapped the Azure DevOps API so that we can inject pre-built build and release processes into Azure DevOps in a few minutes. It's kind of infrastructure code for the infrastructure code for the infrastructure. And then, of course, Microsoft Azure PaaS. Multiple environments, fully scaled, automated. We're putting a layer in between the developer and the infrastructure that means that they have all the processes they need to get the code tested and to get the code live. So let me show you what that kind of looks like. I'm not doing a live demo today, but here's some screenshots from a Microsoft Azure DevOps solution and from a Microsoft Azure PaaS solution. So here's an example of how we hang together the build process. So inside any given build definition, we have the tasks. We're going to grab those sources, we're going to take those files, we're going to make sure we get the artifacts. In here we're using NuGet Restore to essentially build all of the packages and bring all the references in. We're then defining and running the build. So this is using a hosted agent, the VS 2017 hosted agent inside Microsoft Azure. We have 2 agent pools configured in this solution here, which costs around $50, $60 a month to run. And that gives us the ability to run 2 parallel builds on demand, which is more than enough for most organizations. We then have a series of tasks that run after that and essentially publishing those artifacts to the CM and the CD solutions. Here's an example of the triggers. So for this particular implementation, we have continuous integration enabled. So on check-in of a given branch, we take that code, we run the build process, and we pass it over to the release handler. And we focus on variable groups. One of the benefits of variable groups means that you can create a repeatable build and release process, but then configure variable groups to control different environments. So we have a centralized common repository here, and this client has 2 dev infrastructure environments, 1 production and 2 UAT. The beauty here is if you need a dev 3 because you've just spun up a project, you can go in, you can duplicate the variable group, adjust the variables, and then execute the build and release process. In the way that we do this, we have an infrastructure build process and we also have the Sitecore build process. By taking the variable group, we can then execute the infrastructure build process and roll out an entirely new non-scaled Sitecore deployment in a new Azure subscription or an Azure resource group, map the URLs and be running with a brand new clean infrastructure with a branch of your choice in 40-45 minutes. So let's talk about release. Everything's been built, the variable groups are defined where that's going into the release process. How do we get that into the given environments? So here's an example of a deploy pipeline. On the left-hand side with the artifacts, I mentioned that we have the Sitecore repositories and artifacts and the Sitecore infrastructure artifacts. You can see that we have dev, dev1, dev2, UAT2, UAT1 production and production secondary. In this particular customer's environment, what we have here is a series of tasks that can take code between the different dev environments and then promote those through UAT production and production secondary. Production secondary is actually a fully geo-scaled and replicated CD environment in another geographic distribution. This means that we can keep the code synchronized between those environments, and of course in the production solution, this is where we map those into the staging slots and gives us that other level of control. So we use UAT, but we use also staging slots as a pseudo UAT to make sure that we're warmed up, ready to go, and hot swap over in seconds. So what does that look like? Well, pretty simple. We have the ability to go in, stop the Azure service, run the pre-deploy scripts. We have a bunch of IP that sits in the pre-deploy scripts that cleans things up and does things that we need to, index rebuilds and everything else. Deploy the Sitecore, deploy the Xconnect, start the Azure service, and then run the package deployer to make sure that we're getting the environment up to date. You can see here this is configured for Dev1. I'm not going to show you what's inside my production deployment. That's a little bit more complex. So when I get back to my release pipeline, what I can see here is what's happening in my given environments right now. Where is my code? Where is it being promoted to? What's currently live? What was the branch used? What was the release that was used? And what date was it? So screenshot was taken yesterday, and I scrolled down through this environment, and you can see that the build there for 3 rows down is currently in Dev1 and UAT1. But if I was to scroll a little bit further down, you can now see that there was a green build here that was delivered, and that's currently in production and production secondary. So this customer deployed on the 26th of September. We've got UAT deployments coming through on the 8th of October, and I very much suspect that they'll be moving that UAT over into production secondary in the next couple of days. This visualization really gives you an understanding of where code is at a given time. And of course, there are plenty of other tools out there in the marketplace that do the same thing. But the beauty of Azure DevOps is that because I'm an admin of this account, I can actually see all of the visibility. I can see what's going on. But using Azure Active Directory, the grouping and the control and the security model, I can quickly control which teams, which agencies, which developers can see what, who's got control, who's got approval, who doesn't. So in summary, DevOps in a Sitecore context is ultimately about addressing change. If you can demonstrate the control and diligence to the business through discovery and practical solution design, you're going to be on the front foot immediately. You'll then easily align to the best practice of the technology vendor, which, let's face it, Sitecore's pushing you hard to do, your organization's going to be pushing you hard to do, and there's fundamentally no business reason why you don't adopt the best practices for any technology vendor. You should then document that solution design and get sign-off from your key stakeholders, which means you've set expectations on costs, expenditure, and with the business up front, whether that be a micro change or an entirely major platform change. You work with IT, security, and legal and privacy teams up front to demonstrate the power and the value of DevOps and change management, which means you've predicted and allocated the right amount of time to maintain the solution. So what I've talked to you about here is how you can go from no DevOps process to a DevOps process with Microsoft Azure PaaS and Sitecore 9. But what I haven't talked about is the long-term maintenance of that. So those infrastructure scripts that you have built and extended and controlled are going to be out of date the day after you do the release. And the reason they're out of date is because there will be another Sitecore release coming along, which has a slightly different version of WDPs, slightly different ARM template. It's going to be out of date because Microsoft Azure is also updating. They're releasing 1, 2, 3 times a week with new features. You want to make sure you're dedicating the right amount of people in your organization and your dev team to maintaining that DevOps stack and maintaining that infrastructure as code. But once you've got there and got the business to sign off, you can go ahead and you can build out that stack. Change management approved. So my name's Anthony Hook from Data Weavers. Thank you very much for your time.